Thank you. I don't know, we're going to shut that door? Or?
Yeah.
Hello, thanks everyone for coming. We have an hour. The topic is Gustav Landauer, the German Revolution of 1918-19. I think it was in the interest also of the organizers here to talk a bit more about the German Revolution specifically, since this is the radical history zone. I do this talk in variations because there is this book by Gustav Landauer that I'm in a sense responsible for as the translator and editor, Revolution and Other Writings, a political reader. There is a similar book coming out on Erich Mühsam in a couple of months, so sometimes I combine the two in talks I give. Sometimes then I also talk about the history of early German anarchism, and then sometimes I talk about the German Revolution. Sometimes I lose track of what exactly I should focus on, but I'll try to, as I said, today focus on Gustav Landauer and then the German Revolution of 1918-19 and specifically Landauer's role in it. Just real quick, I mean, why am I giving a talk like that and why do I work on books like these? I've been involved in the German-speaking anarchist movement since the late 1980s, since I was in high school in Austria. And a few years ago, some friends of mine in the States wanted some Landauer essays translated. They ended up giving out a little, bringing out a little pamphlet called Anarchism in Germany and Other Essays, and they asked me if I wanted to help out with the translations, and so I did. And then there was further interest in Landauer translations, and somehow the idea was born to compile a proper book, so to speak, with various Landauer texts. And then when PM Press was founded about 3 years ago, I talked to the people running PM Press, and they actually wanted to realize that idea, and so since then I've focused very much on that time. Not that Gustav Landauer or Erich Mühsam for that matter were new to me. I mean, if you're in the German-speaking world and you're interested in anarchism and the history of German-speaking anarchism, those are the two main figures. Internationally, there are other anarchists of German descent who are better known and who've probably had a bigger impact, or who've had a bigger impact internationally. Johann Most and Rudolf Rocker are the two main examples. However, since they spent most of their lives outside of Germany and partly also published in other languages, the two main figures for the history of German anarchism in Germany, so to speak, are Gustav Landauer and Erich Mühsam. And Gustav Landauer is probably the one kind of main reference point. The biggest difference between Landauer and Mühsam in that respect is that Landauer, in a sense, was the deeper thinker and philosopher, so to speak. Mühsam had a more interesting life and was a more interesting character and personality, but Mühsam's writing doesn't necessarily have the theoretical and philosophical depth that Landauer's writing has. Who was Gustav Landauer? I'll just a really short biographical overview. Born 1870, middle-class Jewish family in Karlsruhe, southern Germany. It's nothing spectacular to tell about his childhood, time in school. Out of high school, 1890, moves to Berlin, moves in kind of artistic, literary circles, so-called Friedrichshagener Dichterkreis, a somewhat progressive circle of writers, poets. Publishes a novel, very much influenced by Friedrich Nietzsche, generally considered one of his weakest works, but he was only 19, I guess, when he wrote it. Shortly after that, in the early 1890s, he started socializing more with the emerging anarchist circles in Berlin. So basically, in a sense, Landauer's engagement in anarchism coincides with the sort of birth, if you will, of the anarchist movement in Germany. I mean, there were individuals, radical socialists, who called themselves, self-identified as anarchists in the 1870s and 1880s too. But as a kind of movement, anarchism in Germany really only emerged in the early 1890s, which had to do with the fact that when the Social Democratic Party was revived in 1890 after all socialist and social democratic organization was outlawed in Germany under the so-called socialist laws, Sozialistengesetze, from 1878 to 1890. Very quickly, a radical faction of mainly young social democrats left the party or was kicked out of the party, the so-called Jungen, the young ones. And it was basically out of that circle that a group emerged that embraced the term anarchism and used that for their political philosophy and agitation. The main publishing organ of that group became the journal Der Sozialist, which Landauer got involved in as one of the editors. Not only that, he became one of the most influential editors very quickly. And also, during the 1890s, there's a famous quote from a police file on Landauer where he is named as probably the most dangerous agitator in the radical socialist movement at the time. He also traveled to the socialist congresses in Zurich and London in the 1890s to represent the German anarchist movement. As people here might know, anarchists were kicked out of both of those congresses and had their own meetings, but Landauer was present both those times. And also throughout the 1890s, Landauer was a kind of leading figure within the general mainstream anarchist movement in Germany, so to speak. That's important because that changes towards the end of the 1890s. Because towards the end of the 1890s, there is a split within the editorial collective of Der Sozialist. Many different issues played a role there. One of the central one was disagreement about the role of the working class within the revolutionary process. That working class is the revolutionary subject. That strong focus was questioned by Landauer and a few others, not because working class struggle wasn't considered important for a revolutionary process, but it was almost seen as too simplified. Landauer more and more was looking towards or stressing the necessity of an overall spiritual change that didn't have anything to do with class, like a kind of interpersonal change that is required so that people are actually able to really build and create socialism. So the thought that only by restructuring processes of economic production or by restructuring political decision-making processes, that could never ever establish a socialist society in the long run if people didn't bring that kind of, great inner communal spirit into those communities that would have to be established. So that was the kind of main point of contention. The Landauer faction, so to speak, won, and the other faction left the Sozialist. However, that also weakened the journal to the degree where it wasn't possible for them to financially maintain it. So the Sozialist ended in 1899. Out of that other faction, the so-called Arbeiter-Anarchisten in Germany, workers' anarchists or working class anarchists, they ended up, after restructuring their circles, founding the Federation of German Anarchists and also the journal Der Freie Arbeiter. The federation changed its name after World War I into Federation of Communist Anarchists of Germany, but was the same kind of people that were involved. And the Freie Arbeiter also developed pretty much in the journal for the federation. Those projects existed till 1933, so there's a long kind of 30-year tradition, and they pretty much represented the sort of mainstream general German anarchist movement at the time. The relationship to Landauer and later also Mühsam in a different form were strained, however. So Landauer didn't represent those currents. I'm not going to say much about the Freie Arbeiter Federation either, because their overall influence on German history and German politics was very limited. Using the term sectarian is always difficult because anarchists like to throw that term around, or leftists in general, to discredit people who have different perspectives. So it's kind of difficult to use it. But in the sense of being very secluded and isolated in their own circles, very judgmental of everyone who kind of fall out of one's own understanding of what anarchist thought or action should be like. I mean, that would apply to the people in the Federation, which contributed to the fact that, as I said, they were very isolated, had very little influence on politics in Germany in general. Landauer, after the end of the Sozialist, this kind of sort of disillusionment with the radical socialist movement in Germany, was looking into other options of political organizing. He joined a group called Neue Gemeinschaft, which was founded by the Hart brothers in Berlin, which was kind of sort of a middle-class, esoteric, back to nature sort of project. People focused on building a commune on the outskirts of Berlin, and property was bought and a sort of commune was established. The idea of building a commune, or as Landauer would later call it, a Siedlung, a settlement, as the kind of smallest unit of a socialist society, that idea would stick with Landauer, and I guess that was partly why he was attracted to that group at the time, also because the group was talking about spiritual change and whatnot. However, Landau also there got disillusioned very quickly because it was just, I guess it fit the example of what's, even today, what people criticize a lot about commune movements, that you try to establish this kind of little circle of some kind of pure world and lose all contact with society around you and actually don't have any impact on overall social developments. So after just about a year, Landauer left. The time in the Neue Gemeinschaft was really important, though, for the reason that Landauer met two people who were also involved in that project, who would have a huge influence on the rest of his life and even beyond that. One person was Erich Mühsam, who was a few years younger than Landauer, who was also in the Neue Gemeinschaft, left together with Landauer, and they established their friendship, comradeship there, which lasted to Landauer's death, and actually would kind of find also its climax in a way when both of them worked together in Bavaria for the Council Republic during the German Revolution. I'll say something about that later. The other person that Landauer met in the Neue Gemeinschaft was Martin Buber, Austrian Jewish philosopher, mystic, who had a huge influence on Landauer's further philosophical development, mystical development. As I said before, Landauer already kind of was veering towards those ideas in the late 1890s. Under the influence of Buber, he really focused on mystical philosophical studies for a few years, didn't really do any political work, moved to England for some time, lived in London, also in Brighton, visited with Kropotkin and other anarchists who were here at the time. Then moved to Berlin, just worked in a bookstore, did translations together with his partner Hedwig Lachmann, who was a well-respected German poet and translator. And it took until 1906 till he really started writing about political issues again in the context of his relationship with Martin Buber, because Martin Buber was editing a series of books in Frankfurt at the time. Each book focused on a different, very broad, general social political topic. And Buber wanted to have a book on the topic of revolution, and he wrote a letter to Landauer saying that he can't think of anyone who would write a better book about revolution than Landauer. And so Landauer said yes, and got to work. The text Revolution is the main text in this collection, hence the title, Revolution and Other Writings. And I guess partly that kind of rekindled Landauer's interest in political activism, and shortly after the book was published, he revived Der Sozialist, which then was basically his own journal. And he founded den Sozialistischen Bund, the Socialist Bund, Federation or Association. I just wanted to say something about that. I explain something about the word Bund in the book and then leave it untranslated, because there is a reason, because you have these words in German too, Föderation, Allianz. There's a reason why Landauer didn't use them but it's kind of like a detailed question. Anyway, I will continue speaking of the Socialist Bund, but Bund means as much as a federation alliance. What Landau tried to do, and I'll read two short excerpts, is the only, we don't have so much time, so I'm not going to read too much, but I read two short parts that explain a little better the ideas that Landau associated with the Socialist Bund. What I said before about Landau's kind of mystical, philosophical, mystical understanding of socialism, anarchism, I think that's one of the unique features of Landau's understanding of politics and of Landau's thinking. And it's actually a feature that I would say in its uniqueness remains. Like if you look at Landau's understanding of what socialism is and the strong way that he ties it to his mystical understanding of relationship between people, remains unique to this day. I should also say in this context that sometimes, especially in the English literature about Landau, people kind of like to use the term romantic socialism, which to me seems a bit unfortunate. I mean, you can discuss, the use of different terms forever, and there are good reasons for using some terms and not so good reasons for using them and good reasons for using others. The problem I see with romantic is that very often it has kind of the implication of, there's a kind of naivete about it, or there's something slightly esoteric maybe, or something dreamlike. Like with Landau's mystical understanding, it doesn't have anything really to do with that. I mean, it's very kind of solid, very solid mystical study / search, which really doesn't have any kind of esoteric aspect to it. And again, to me, it doesn't have anything kind of romantic to it either. The other parts that at the time were really unique about Landau's approach, which are expressed in the way he imagined the Socialist Bund, are maybe no longer that original because they've been formulated in different ways over the last 30, 40 years. But at the time, they were pretty unique, and those are two. One was the idea of building a socialist society based on small rural settlements, as Landau called them, where people, it's very similar to kind of more modern day ideas of communes. People go out, establish in direct democracy, self-sufficient communities where state power is not needed and where a capitalist economy is not needed. Ideally, more and more of these communes or settlements will be established, and the networks, a more complex economy could emerge, etc. So that was a strong idea, Landau. Connected to that was also the idea that in order to build socialism / anarchism, for Landau those terms were synonyms. Like true socialism in his understanding was anarchism, and there was no true socialism outside of anarchism, so to speak. So in order to establish that, you have to start building it, and that's what your focus is. The focus for him in anarchist activism is not to smash the state or to smash capitalism, because in his understanding you can't smash those things. I mean, you can, I'll read a quote later, as he says, you can smash a window or you can smash a building or whatever, but you can't smash the state or capitalism. That those are based on relationships between human beings. So in order to abolish those things, you have, as he says, you have to create different relationships between people. So this is what the focus is. So the focus, in a sense, in his words, the focus is on building and not on destroying, if you will. Ideally, I guess in his thought, the state and capitalism would eventually just kind of wither away as soon as those kind of alternatives or those ways of socialist living were kind of strong enough amongst all of us so that the state and capitalism were no longer necessary. As I said, I'll read a couple of quotes to maybe illustrate this a little better. The first one is just the beginning of a text, kind of like a program for the Socialist Bund that was published shortly after the Bund was founded in 1908 under the title, "What Does the Socialist Bund Want?" Landauer writes, "The Socialist Bund wants to unite all humans who are serious about realizing socialism. You have been told that socialism can only replace exploitation, proletarization, and capitalism in a distant and uncertain future. You have been told to wait for things to develop. We say socialism will never come if you do not create it. There are those among you who say that the revolution has to come first. But how? And from where? From above? State socialism? Where are the examples, the beginnings, the seeds of true socialist labor, exchange, and community? We do not even have traces or hints. People do not even understand the necessity for these examples. Do they really want to be dependent on lawyers, politicians, custodians of the people? Nothing good has ever come from them. We say that everything must be turned upside down. We refuse to wait for the revolution in order to begin the realization of socialism. We begin the realization of socialism to bring about the revolution. All of the organizations that the working people have so far created for themselves address life within capitalism. These organizations can bring about small improvements in the lives of individuals and for certain trades, but they do not lead out of capitalism or towards socialism." A second quote, sorry, I'll just have to look for those quotes. As I said, I focus on different things in my talks and hence read different quotes. I just gotta see what the most appropriate are here. I read two more. I read one short quote about those rural settlements that Landauer was talking about and that are really important to him. He writes in a text called Die Siedlung, the settlement. "The socialist village with workshops and village factories, with meadows and fields and gardens, with cattle and flocks and chickens. You big city proletarians, get used to the idea, as alien and strange as it may at first seem. This is the only remaining way to begin the realization of socialism. Socialism is the return to natural labor. It is a natural, multifaceted connection of all activities. It is the union of intellectual and manual labor, of artisanry and agriculture, of education and work, of play and work. Think about how your children grow up today. Think about the horror of child labor in capitalism. Think about how alienated today's schools are and how they produce empty hearts and barren minds. Think about how self-explanatory the union of work, recreation, and education, including the most advanced sciences, will be in rural settlements." The last quote I'm going to read, again, short. It's from a really short Landauer text, which is also one of his best-known texts, and which includes a quote which is by far the most used, best-known Landauer quote, which received special attention in recent months because Julian Assange was using it as an email signature for a couple of years. You call it an email signature, right? Those things that you have at the bottom of each email. I'll point it out. I'll read the quote that I read is a bit longer than that. Those actual two sentences that are kind of well known. It's from a text called "Weak Statesmen, Weaker People." Landauer writes, "On the one side, we have the power of the state and the powerlessness of the masses, which are divided into helpless individuals. On the other side, we have socialist organization, a society of societies, an alliance of alliances, in other words, a people. The struggle between the two sides must become real. The power of the states, the principle of government, and those who represent the old order will become weaker and weaker. The entire system would vanish without a trace if the people began to constitute themselves as a people apart from the state. However, the people have not yet grasped this. They have not yet understood that the state will fulfill a certain function and remain an inevitable necessity as long as its alternative, the socialist reality, does not exist. A table can be overturned and a window can be smashed. However, those who believe that the state is also a thing or a fetish that can be overturned or smashed are sophists and believers in the word." Now is that famous quote, "The state is a social relationship, a certain way of people relating to one another. It can be destroyed by creating new social relationships. That means by people relating to one another differently." Both the Socialist Bund and the Sozialist ended in 1914. with the outbreak of World War I, which basically made it impossible both for reasons of state repression and economic circumstances for those projects to be maintained. From 1914 to 1918, during the war, Landauer was mainly trying to organize anti-war, anti-militaristic resistance in Germany, which was very difficult and very frustrating and never really got off the ground. That was really strong also in broad, kind of the broad socialist movement in Germany, really strong support for the war, strong nationalist sentiments. A lot of German pacifists had gone into exile, mainly to Switzerland, the Dada Circle, for example, around Hugo and others. So Landau and also Mühsam were some of the very few kind of lone voices trying to organize and as I said, weren't very successful. However, when the war ended, and now we come to the German Revolution, when the war ended in late 1918, the political situation in Germany rapidly changed as well and took on a sort of dramatic form. I mean, Germany lost the war. In that context, triggered by a rebellion of Navy soldiers in Wilhelmshaven and Kiel, late October 1918, which within a couple of days spread to workers in different cities who went on strike. And it became obvious that the Kaiserreich, the German Empire, wouldn't kind of survive that historical situation, so to speak. So the Kaiser went to Belgium. And then what happened was that on one and the same day, the 9th of November 1918 in Berlin, the Social Democrats declared Germany a republic against the explicit wishes of some social democratic leaders who were trying to move Germany towards a constitutional monarchy. Constitutional monarchy. And generally had an idea, even those social democrats who wanted to really establish a republic, the idea was to establish a kind of, parliamentary democracy. While you had radical currents that wanted to establish a Soviet council-based socialist system, partly inspired by the example of the Soviet Union, partly inspired by other thinkers, anarchist theories. And that pretty much created, and I'm really trying to make this short, it pretty much created a civil war-like situation in Germany for a few months, where the Social Democrats always kind of had the upper hand, but where resistance from the radical council, communist, anarchist circles was very strong, at least in certain parts of Germany. What happened, and this causes a lot of bitterness within the German left to this day, what happened was that the Social Democrats used reactionary army units, militias, if you will, reactionary soldiers that came back from the war, that kind of were in a sense unemployed and formed these reactionary militias. There were various forms of them, the Freikorps, Free Corps, the most famous, and they were used basically kind of as mercenaries by the Social Democrats when the regular army that they kept in itself wasn't able to crush uprisings and rebellions, like in Bremen, for example, the Council Republic, or the Council Republic in Bavaria. And I'm going to talk about that a little bit because that's where Gustav Landauer was involved in. What happened in Bavaria was, so this was a really confusing time again in Germany. Like you had again, one and the same day, two different forms of government, so to speak, or political systems were proclaimed. In Bavaria, 2 days before these proclamations happened in Berlin, Kurt Eisner proclaimed Bavaria a republic, which again caused more confusion because it wasn't even clear whether Bavaria would now be an independent country or whether that was still a part of the German Reich and how all that would work. Kurt Eisner was the leader of the Bavarian Independent Social Democrats. The Independent Social Democrats were founded in 1917. It was basically a faction that left the Social Democrats because they started to oppose the war. from 1914 to until 1970, the only social democratic representative in parliament who opposed the war was Karl Liebknecht. No one else. However, in 1917, there were more people, and they formed the Independent Social Democrats and left the Social Democratic Party. Kurt Eisner was one of them, and he functioned as prime minister in Bavaria after he made that proclamation. However, and what he did, right, so what he did, Mühsam was already in Munich because Mühsam had moved to Munich already in 1906, 1907. Landauer was called to Munich by Eisner because Eisner knew Landauer, and he wanted Landauer to come to contribute to the kind of revolutionary process that Eisner wanted to see in Bavaria, mainly by giving talks and spreading his ideas about, personal and spiritual development that was necessary for socialism. However, the ideas that Eisner had for Bavaria weren't quite the ideas that Landauer and Mühsam had. I mean, Eisner definitely supported the council idea, like council basically directly elected units of representation in factories and in certain agricultural areas, and also among soldiers. So people always talk about the soldiers, workers, and peasants' councils. However, Eisner also wanted to have a parliament, and kind of imagined that those two was kind of like a two-power system, as people call it sometimes. So you'd have a parliament, which is like a representative parliament where party members are included as we know it, and then you'd have these councils, and that was all very unclear how that should work. But in Eisner's vision, somehow you'd have these kind of two forces of power, and that somehow and overall authority and should be divided basically between those two. For people like Landau and Mühsam, the parliament idea was not relevant. Like they, to put it simply, wanted to give all power to those councils. That should be the center. Hence the slogan "Alle Macht den Räten," which was the big slogan at the time, all power to the councils. What happened then in Bavaria was that Eisner, again, against the explicit advice of Landau and Mühsam, called for general elections in Bavaria in early 1919, where the Independent Social Democrats got like 3% or something. The Social Democrats won and formed the cabinet. What happened then also a couple of months later was that Eisner was shot dead by a reactionary soldier. So it looked like the kind of more radical revolutionary course that seemed possible in Bavaria was kind of lost and gone, if not someone did something to kind of save that possibility. So that's when, in early April 1919, a group of people, including Landau and Mühsam, proclaimed Bavaria a council republic. One thing that you can sometimes read in histories of anarchism or whatnot is that the Bavarian Council Republic was one of those occasions where anarchists took power, or where anarchists had a really big role in like a revolutionary moment. This is somewhat misleading. And now we come back to something that I said earlier. The German anarchist movement was in no way involved in the Bavarian Council Republic. The anarchist element, so to speak, in the Bavarian Council Republic were two figures, and that was Gustav Landau and Erich Mühsam, who were key figures. Hardly any of the other people, also in the close circle, the first group of so-called people's delegates, were anarchists. There were people from the Independent Social Democrats, there were even some Social Democrats, and then there were some people who weren't really affiliated with any particular organization or even ideology, but who had kind of joined that group because it seemed like an interesting historical moment that opened up possibilities. The maybe best known example for that is Silvio Gesell, economist known for free money theories, who had come to Munich just a couple of weeks prior, and then was included as an economic advisor, people's delegate for economy, because people like Landau and Mühsam thought he had good ideas. But that's as far as his involvement with Bavaria or anarchism or the Council Republic really went. What happened then was that this Council Republic, to make it short, one of the key factors that basically contributed to the fact that the Council Republic was doomed to fail from the beginning was that the Communist Party, completely against the expectations of, for example, Landau and Mühsam, did not join and support the Council Republic for the simple reason that they thought the time wasn't right. They thought the Council Republic couldn't survive. It was important to establish a stronger organization of workers first. And so there was no support from the Communist Party, which again kind of meant that that experiment was doomed to fail from the beginning. After 2 weeks, there was the first government attack. The Social Democratic government retreated from Munich and went to Bamberg, which is a town in northern Bavaria. After 2 weeks, they sent the army and police to Munich to crush the Council Republic. They failed. However, they managed to arrest some of the key figures, including Erich Mühsam, which possibly saved Erich Mühsam's life at the time, because when 1 week after that first attempt, the second attempt was started, and this time not only with Bavarian soldiers and Bavarian police, but with federal army soldiers that were sent from the Social Democrats in Berlin, plus with the Free Corps militias. When they went to Munich to crush the Republic, another week later, on May 1st, 1919, they succeeded, and again arrested some of the key figures, also Gustav Landauer, and in Gustav Landauer's case, he was lynched a day later by soldiers who had captured him. I should also say that, since I mentioned the Communist Party came to defend the Council Republic during the first assault after 2 weeks, and so during the third week, they were kind of involved, but it was not because they really believed in the Council Republic, but they were caught in a historical situation where they had to make a choice, where there was an actual struggle happening in Munich, an armed struggle between the army and the Council Republicans, and there the communists decided to side with the Council Republicans, and then ended up, in a sense, inheriting this Council Republic that they never wanted. And somewhat tragically, I guess, Eugen Leviné, the leader of the Communist Party in Germany, then was also executed for his role in the Council Republic. This also, actually, the end of the Bavarian Council Republic kind of marks the end of most of the radical hopes that were part of the German Revolution. This was really the last kind of bigger attempt to establish a more radical socialist system in Germany, except for maybe early 1920 in the Ruhrgebiet, the Ruhr Valley, when there were armed workers' units and councils who tried to establish again a more kind of radical council-based system in connection with the Kapp Putsch, one of the reactionary coups in Germany, which didn't succeed mainly because of a general strike that workers called in Germany right away, and because of a lot of armed workers' resistance, and workers in the Ruhr Valley tried to kind of use that moment to maybe to start the last attempt to establish this kind of more sort of radical-based socialism, which again was crushed by the army sent in by the Social Democrats in connection with some reactionary militias, if you will. Landauer, to sum that up, so Landauer dies in 1919, and it was mainly actually Erich Mühsam through his writing in the 1920s, and also Martin Buber, again, so his two friends from the Neue Gemeinschaft, who kept his legacy in Germany alive in the 1920s. Mühsam just because he referenced Landau a lot and wrote about him, and Buber published a lot of previously unpublished Landauer texts and letters. And the most tangible influence of Landauer's thoughts, however, in the 1920s was not so much in Germany, it was more in Palestine. Landauer's influence on the kibbutz movement was really strong. If people want to read or have read James Horrocks' The Living Revolution, Anarchism and the Kibbutz Movement, there's a lot about Landauer's influence in there, which is a really important chapter. Then, with the Nazis taking power in 1933, anarchism in Germany basically disappears for obvious reasons, and it really took till the late 1960s till the anarchists movement in Germany was kind of revived. Interestingly enough, also, if you look at the history of publications by reprints of Landauer texts, publications about Landauer, there is nothing basically between the early 1930s and the late 1960s. So in the context of the protest movement of the late 1960s, which kind of led to a revival of anarchism also in the German-speaking world, it also led to a revival, so to speak, of those key figures like Gustav Landauer and Erich Mühsam. And which was also the reason why since then, as I said before, also like from this historical perspective, it really established them as the two main figures of German anarchism, although, as I said, during their time, they were kind of outsiders. I mean, this day, people who write about the Federation of German Anarchists or the Freie Arbeiter are historians and scholars. Other than that, like within activist circles or the current anarchist movement in Germany, that's really, I mean, it's a part of history, but that doesn't have much influence or is not really used as a major source of inspiration. That's mainly Landauer and Mühsam, plus, but I'm not gonna have to stop, plus the FAUD, Freie Arbeiterunion Deutschlands, in the 1920s, anarcho-syndicalist organization, where Rudolf Rocker, during his time in Germany as an adult, this was kind of the main project that he was involved in. They actually also played, the FAUD did play a role in the uprising in the 1920s in the Ruhr Valley, unlike the Federation. We have 10 minutes left, so I talked a bit longer than I thought I would, but there's some time left for comments and questions. Thanks very much for listening.
Tease out a little bit more about the influence of the, because you did touch upon romanticism a little bit, which is kind of one of my interests. And I know romanticism is quite a slippery term. I know there's one definition which I think is quite useful is actually is a form of anti-capitalism, but because that's kind of broad enough to mean something, but it also means that it covers all sorts of feudal, right-wing, revolutionary strains. But he was obviously, well, I don't know so much about German romanticism, but presumably he kind of was the next generation on from the kind of key German romantics, Goethe or Novalis or Schelling or all those sorts of people. How does that sort of feed through into the kind of mystical aspect of Landauer that you were talking about?
I think mainly if you look at his writing, mainly it's expressed in the fact that there is appreciation for a lot of romantic writers. Bettina von Arnim, for example, like other names that kind of pop up in Landauer's writings, that, you know, writers that he references positively, but not in any extensive way. It's like, you know, sometimes examples of, you know, German writers who had, as he says, Geist, you know, had spirit and who were important and influence and source of inspiration. But there is not really in Landauer's writing, he doesn't deal with that period of German history to an extent where I would say just the fact that he references that period so much, for example, would justify speaking of a kind of romantic socialism or something. It doesn't, you know, he doesn't engage that time that much explicitly, you know. Obviously, as you said, I mean, this is definitely right. Like, this is obviously a kind of part of German literary and philosophical history that he's building on and that influences his writing, but it's nothing that he ever really makes explicit that much. However, I mean, this is an interesting question, Landauer generally, like what's explicit in his writing, like which influences are explicit and which aren't that explicit. I think there are different reasons why some are more explicit than others, which don't necessarily have so much to do with the fact that they were so much stronger. But with other decisions, it was kind of maybe more important to sometimes for him to stress certain influences and to not stress others so much. Like one example that's also kind of obvious is when he writes about mysticism, he almost exclusively references the history of Christian mysticism. Hardly ever the history of Jewish mysticism, which he definitely knew about, not only because he was Jewish, but also because of his close relationship to Martin Buber. This is a whole separate discussion, the way that Landauer dealt with his Jewish identity, but there, for example, also it's clear that there is an influence of the Jewish mystical tradition, but it's hardly ever explicit in his writing. So something similar could be said about the Romantic period. But if
people like William Morris and Edward Carpenter, they're very much kind of grounded in the generation before,
right,
and in the kind of late 19th century.
So it'd be an exciting study to do that, like let's say the influence of the Romantic German movement on Landau or whatever. But one would have to do a bit of stuff. Like it's not, you don't open Landau's text and it's like, oh yeah, right. He read those and those people and he thought that was a good idea. And it's not, you have to do proper research and connect the dots.
You said that his influence on sort of current anarchism in Germany is very little or minimal. Are there technical reasons for that in terms of his forms of analysis and his notion of relationships within society that people feel now are radically different and therefore can't draw on this thing?
I don't know if I said that the influence was minimal on contemporary anarchism. I mean, in Germany, it depends. Like, I mean, if you look at, there are no settlements exist, that claim to be settlements in the spirit of Gustav Landau or anything like that. But as an inspirational figure, he does have, an influence. However, true, even there, people in Germany who really kind of read Gustav Landau, and study, it's limited to a relatively small circle of academics, scholars. For a lot of the activists, as I said before, Mühsam, for example, is the more interesting figure. He's usually easier to read. It's kind of more fun to read. Mühsam also was a more interesting character who wrote a lot about, was a bohemian, wrote a lot about free love, and I don't know, things that people also today maybe can relate to more easily. Landau is often said to have been personally a fairly conservative figure. Like family life for Landau was very important for him. That was one of the smallest units of socialism in the sense of people living together in the spirit of ideally mutual aid and solidarity and whatnot. The influence, right? So I guess it's mainly on that level, and why it doesn't translate so much maybe into current anarchist activism. To be honest, I'm almost tempted to say because there isn't that much. Also in the German-speaking world. So it's maybe more of that, actually, rather than... I think a lot of Landau's ideas are relevant to this day, to be honest. It's just that... This is maybe a controversial statement, but it's just that we don't really have that kind of movement that is able to put a lot of those into practice, at least not in any kind of wider sense.
What precisely was his view of parties, in the process towards socialism?
Right.
Did he take a hardcore view, or was he very clear? Was it?
No, there is actually a text in the book called The Party. That's kind of one of his key texts about the Social Democratic Party. The short answer is very, very critical. Like, there is no kind of sense of, like when he talks about the necessity of this gradual kind of everyday change towards socialism, it's not in the sense of it's not like a reformist kind of touch, It's like, well, you can't smash the state and you have to build this and it takes longer, and so sure, parties are, not really the ideal, but, what are we going to do now? So we try to use those as a vehicle. It's not about that. It's just that it is a very kind of radical approach, but as I said, I think the main difference just is that, as I said before, you focus on building an alternative rather than, and through that kind of making what you oppose irrelevant, rather than starting with trying to, push that aside, and then what really, if you don't have anything created that you actually can put in its place. As Landau also writes in his understanding of revolutions, it's not that Landau thinks revolutions aren't important and can't, lead to new conditions that make it, for example, easier to start with this everyday creation of socialism. But as he says, at the end of the day, because also A, these alternatives haven't been built yet, B, this kind of spiritual understanding that he sees as a requirement for socialism, because those things aren't there, that's the reason why after every revolution you have new forms of domination and authority established, because there's nothing to kind of fill that void in a sense otherwise. So yeah, and in terms of party organization, like there's really nothing. Like even more so, that's another difference. Landau was much more critical of, for example, all sorts of communist organizations, including communist parties or even trade unions in that sense, and Erich Mühsam, for example, who saw more the possibility of working together with them in a revolutionary process. For Landau, that was totally, there was no spirit in those parties, there was nothing really positive at all. I think we have to stop because there's another workshop at 2, so we have to be good anarchists and and take self-responsibility and leave the